Could Chozen beat Mike Barnes? Could Mike Barnes beat Johnny? Could Bobby beat them all? You saw my rankings, and today we're going to talk about your thoughts, your comments, to see just who is the best fighter. I'm Ken Cole. Please like, subscribe, and share. And if you have any ideas on who the best fighter is, please join the discussion down in the comments. So before we get to your comments to figure out which fighter is the best around, take a second to listen to this amazing cover of the song You're the Best Around by Chozen Trumpet. Thank you, Chozen, and you can find a link to the full video down in the description. So first off, I want to thank you for all of the amazing comments on my last video. It is a question that fans have been asking for years, and I put my humble rankings out there on who the best fighter is, but many of you put many well thought out comments, and so many comments, in fact, I can't get to them all in this discussion. But we're going to pick a few and talk about some different ideas that people brought up on who really is the best fighter. So if we have one fighter that's the most popular in the comments of the last video, it is Chozen by a huge margin. You'll notice that in my video, I ranked Mike Barnes number 1. So let's go over some comments about why Chozen should be ranked number 1 or the best fighter. Chozen is the only one who landed a hit on Miyagi. For that reason, he's better than the rest of them. And then we had another counter comment to that. My problem with that though is that Mr. Miyagi had his back turned to help Daniel, and they weren't even fighting, so it was a very cheap shot. Which this is a great point too. And I mentioned in my video, Chozen is the only villain in the Karate Kid universe to land a hit on Mr. Miyagi. So I don't know, I think that's notable, but I don't think that necessarily raises Chozen above the other fighters necessarily, because Miyagi and Chozen weren't really fighting. Miyagi did have his back turned, so I don't know if that means that Chozen would do better than the other fighters just for that reason. And Richard Williams says, "Hey Ken, you're my favorite Karate Kid Cobra Kai YouTuber. I'm actually excited when you put out a new video. Keep up the good work." Well, thank you, Richard. And if you enjoy what I do on this channel, the best thing, the most supportive thing you can do is just take a second and click subscribe and like. It makes such a huge difference, and I appreciate all my subscribers. Thank you so much. Okay, so the next comment. Chozen learned personally from Sato, has a direct lineage to Miyagi-Do, and trained US Marines on Okinawa. Likely still doing so now that Sato has passed on. He would destroy Barnes. And here's another comment. He was literally training military soldiers in Karate Kid 2, and he's also very good at karate. All Barnes did was karate, but he was definitely nowhere near Chozen's level. He can beat many military soldiers at the same time. There's no way in hell Johnny would even stand a chance against Chozen. Okay, and I agree. Chozen is an amazing character and has an amazing background. He is Sato's best student. And Sato, as we see in the ad for his dojo, he has the biggest karate dojo in Okinawa. Chozen is his number 1 student, and it looks like he helps to teach all of these US military. So that's really something in Chozen's favor. He has a very strong background in his mastery of karate. Although if we look at that footage, I mean, look at that. Are they just giving out belts like candy at Sato's dojo? It's like all those military students are just standing around waiting for their stomachs to get kicked by Chozen. Just using the canon, Mike was covered in national karate magazines. He was winning multiple tournaments, presumably around the country. He was specifically recruited by a wealthy karate master. So I'd say Mike is likely the best. So that's the question. If Chozen is excellent in Okinawa, if he is the number 1 student of the largest karate dojo in Okinawa, how does that compare with Mike Barnes, who has real-world winning experience nationally in the United States, which is a much larger country? The pool of challengers is potentially much bigger for Mike Barnes. So he's perhaps more accomplished as a fighter than Chozen. But then again, in Okinawa, perhaps the fighters are trained to a much higher level than they generally are in the United States. Barnes is stronger than every Karate Kid antagonist, but Chozen would kill him because unlike Barnes, Chozen has no problem killing someone for real. Chozen was at the point where he felt so disgraced that he was ready to kill Daniel to regain his honor, at least in his own eyes. But is Chozen a killer? Or is that only a special circumstance? Because it seems like Chozen has a moral code. He has a code of honor. And he wouldn't just go out and kill people in cold blood. It seems like it would have to be a specific circumstance where you'd have to offend Chozen a certain way before he would kill you.
Hey, man! Daniel-san, are you okay?
You insulted my honor again. And I kill you.
With Mike Barnes, I don't know if he's a killer. He certainly was willing to put Jessica and Daniel in a life-threatening situation in Devil's Cauldron. That may have all been a huge bluff. Obviously he couldn't follow through with it because Terry would be upset because his plan would be wrecked.
Remember the game plan.
But at the same time, is Mike Barnes capable of killing, or does it matter? Even if Mike Barnes wouldn't kill, would he be willing to do almost everything but kill someone for no good reason other than money? Mike Barnes seems to maybe lack that code of honor. He doesn't really seem to have strong morals, whereas Chozen seems to have that. So Chozen could be dangerous because he would kill you if you offended his honor, but Mike Barnes might completely disable you and beat you up for no good reason other than money. So I don't know. I don't know what's worse. Okay, Chozen hands down the best of the best because he'll give you the shirt off his back.
You keep for your collection.
Mike Barnes is just a
Slime ball.
Okay, so here's an interesting way to split the difference between Mike Barnes and Chozen. I'm assuming we're talking about back in the 80s. Barnes might possibly beat Chozen in a tournament, but in a street fight, Chozen would have him for breakfast. And this was an idea that I saw over and over again in the comments, that Chozen would be much better in a street fight and Barnes would be better in a tournament. The only thing is how Mike Barnes is presented is that he is really good outside the ring as well. After Daniel won the death match, Mike Barnes, the first altercations that Mike Barnes had with Daniel were street fights. I mean, they were not in a tournament, and Mike Barnes completely dominated.
Don't do that! There's nothing you got that I can't counter. Your karate's a joke.
If you look at who the characters are, we don't know too much about their backgrounds. Chozen looks like he was trained by Sato, but he also benefited from the money that Sato had. It didn't look like Chozen had a rough upbringing. It seemed like he was very much into clothes and fashion. He had looked like expensive chains. So it seems like he definitely had money. Whereas Mike Barnes, in my video, Mike Barnes Master Bully, I kind of go over that Mike Barnes could come from a much rougher background, not necessarily a high-income background, and that he might have actually had to really fight to protect himself or to claim what was his. He might have actually had a lot more street fighting in his background if it was a rougher upbringing than Chozen, who had maybe much more of a privileged background. So I don't know, I think if you take that together with the fact that Mike Barnes really dominated Daniel in street fights, it might be really close in a street fight between Mike Barnes and Chozen. Okay, so now we're getting to an idea that a lot of people brought up, and that has to do with plot demands of the movie. The trend is that each movie, they all got better and harder. So Barnes would be considered the toughest. Daniel beat Chozen straight up in a real fight. Mike Barnes whooped Daniel in a real fight and pummeled him during the tournament. So that gets to the idea of how these movies are presented. Each movie, the antagonist kind of has to be heightened and is tougher, to make it a harder challenge for Daniel to overcome, because these are underdog movies and Daniel has to be the underdog. So by that logic, Mike Barnes has to be tougher than Chozen because he is the new challenge in the third movie. Even after everything Daniel's learned in the first two movies, there is a new challenge that's even harder for Daniel to overcome. So that's why Mike Barnes has to be better than Chozen. And that's something I talked about in my last video too, is that in the previous two movies, Daniel won in the tournament and then he won in a fight to the death. So after that, in part 3, he really gets dominated in street fights and in the tournament. So I think you have to give props to Mike Barnes there. It seems like he's pretty good in both arenas. Okay, along those lines, by the rules of movie making, the villain in the third film has to be more powerful than the villain in the second film. The second and third films are kind of in the wrong order, which is why everyone is so conflicted on who is better. And this is a really popular idea for Karate Kid fans. It's really the idea that part 3 should be part 2, and part 2 should be part 3. And that makes sense in a way. I mean, what would the ultimate challenge for Daniel be? If you look at Chozen, he is the embodiment, you would think, of the ultimate challenge. It's not just a tournament, it's an enemy from Okinawa. He's trained all his life. He's not afraid to kill. So it seems like the stakes are much higher with Chozen. And there's a lot more personal connection to Daniel and Miyagi. So it seems like that should be the ultimate challenge for the third movie. It's an interesting idea, but the order of the movies is the order of the movies. And so that's the way it is. But if you wanted to hold to the canon order of the movies, instead of the villains getting progressively stronger and more challenging, a way you could kind of harmonize Chozen being stronger than Mike Barnes would be to weaken Daniel. So perhaps Daniel's in a weakened state in part 3 so that Mike Barnes is much more of a challenge than he should be. And that's where these next comments come in. I heard an interesting argument that Daniel, although physically healthy against Barnes, was addressing PTSD issues from his fight with Chozen. So when Daniel had fights with Barnes in and out of the tournament, he was unable to execute on his training because of freezing up and PTSD. And then another comment. To be fair, Johnny and Chozen weren't in a clear state of mind while fighting Daniel, like how Mike Barnes was. Also, it's noted that Daniel was suffering from some sort of PTSD from his death match from Karate Kid 2. Meanwhile, Terry Silver got into Daniel's head, making him lose all focus. So what about this idea of Daniel having PTSD? Well, you would think that in a fight to the death, you would potentially be traumatized. If Daniel thought he was going to die, if he had this lethal threat coming after him, you would think that that actually might cause some trauma. That would be a really interesting theme from Karate Kid 3 is how do you deal with trauma? What's the right way to deal with trauma? What are the effects of trauma? Do Terry Silver and John Kreese deal with their PTSD in a good way or a bad way? Do they exploit Daniel's trauma in order to manipulate him? What are the long-term consequences of violence? Why is it important to choose the non-violent path as Miyagi wants to do? Is that really what the movie's doing in part 3? I don't know. I think it's probably up to your own interpretation. However, this next commenter disagrees. Daniel and Mike had several violent encounters prior to the tournament where Daniel didn't show any sign of psychological fear or despair against Mike. In fact, he taunted Mike in a bold way in their first encounter, and Daniel was still outmatched by him, and Mike could have had several opportunities to severely injure or kill him had it not been for the rescue of Miyagi and Terry Silver. Right, so that's the counter-argument to the PTSD is that Daniel really didn't seem to show signs of PTSD in the beginning of the movie. And then there's the question of whether the movie Karate Kid 3 really presents Daniel as a weaker fighter than part 2. You'll notice the character of Dennis. Okay, this is Terry Silver's professional trainer. He brings Dennis in to train Mike Barnes to beat Daniel. So obviously this guy has to be pretty good. So the question is, how does Daniel do against Dennis? Well, we see that in the beginning of the movie.
Just take off, right?
You take off!
Dennis, take it out!
The second Dennis provokes Daniel, Daniel dominates him. Daniel makes very short work of Dennis. So obviously Daniel still has his skill from part 2 and part 1. He still knows his karate. So it's kind of tough to say that Daniel really totally regressed from part 2. Maybe it's easier to say that Barnes was just that much better. But here's another comment about Daniel's mental state. I think one thing needs to be pointed out. Daniel was not in the proper mindset when fighting Barnes in the tournament because Silver had twisted his brain so much. Terry Silver manipulated him so well that Daniel was more afraid to fight Barnes in a points tournament than he was Chozen to the death. Was it Mike Barnes by himself that was dominating Daniel? Or was it Terry Silver basically manipulating the situation, manipulating Mike Barnes and manipulating Daniel so that Mike Barnes had an advantage, a mental advantage? Terry's all about psychological manipulation, and one of his things he was doing was manipulating Daniel to be a student, but he was also manipulating Daniel to be afraid, to be really out of his element. And is that why Mike Barnes did so well against Daniel? Something else I thought of I didn't see in the comments was you could also say that the fact that Terry Silver was training Daniel, he got to learn Daniel's strengths and weaknesses, and he was able to train Mike Barnes in a way and instruct him on how to exploit Daniel's weaknesses. So in that way, Mike Barnes might have had a huge advantage compared to Chozen and the Cobra Kais, in that Terry Silver personally was examining Daniel and seeing what his weak points were and kind of passing that information to Mike Barnes, if that makes sense. The only thing about that is that Mike Barnes really dominated Daniel even before Terry got to know Daniel and his fighting style. So it does look like Mike Barnes was quite good. And here's another comment along those lines. Never understood how Daniel got punked by Barnes after defeating Chozen in a death match. And there could be a lot of explanations as to why that could be. I think probably the easiest explanation is Mike Barnes is that good. And here's another comment that basically says Daniel had it really easy in Karate Kid 3. Don't forget, Mike fought the most seasoned, experienced version of Daniel, as well as fresh. Daniel didn't have to fight at all, and Mike has several fights that day. Okay, this comment really speaks in favor of Mike Barnes. He basically sliced his way through the All Valley tournament, no problem. He had, I don't know how many fights he had to go through that day. I don't know what, maybe 5, maybe 10 fights before fighting Daniel. Whereas Daniel didn't have to fight anyone that year. He was totally fresh and he was at his most experienced.
It says under the new rules, the defending champion only needs to fight in the final match. Isn't that great? I mean, that's one fight. That limits my fights to just one. It's better than what I had to put up with last year, right?
Hey.
Right, and then, you know, let's face it, it's another year, it's a year later, I'm a lot more experienced, right?
Hey.
He should have been able to do his best against Mike Barnes, but we saw what happened. He basically won kind of on a fluke at the end, just one move and sudden death. But we also had some comments about the other characters. Dutch. Dutch looks physical, the strongest, and the most aggressive. He is super underrated in my opinion. It was really hard to rank the Cobras because we really didn't see much of Dutch fighting, and Daniel eliminated all the other fighters, so Dutch could have been quite good as well. And I definitely would love to see Dutch back in Cobra Kai. If that's possible, I'm sending it out to the universe. I would love to see Dutch in Cobra Kai, would love to see him fight and see if how prison has affected his fighting resolve. But then of course, there's Bobby. It says in the movie that Bobby was last year's finalist, so he must have lost to Johnny as he won the whole tournament the year before. And this is a really great point that I missed putting in the video, is that Bobby was actually the runner-up to Johnny in the previous year's tournament, which means that he was second place. He was already really good. And if he wanted to be champion, that was certainly within reach. Although, why didn't he win the previous year? Well, that's a great question, and this next comment kind of gets to that. So basically, you're saying Kreese wanted to protect Johnny as his #1 student by sacrificing Bobby? I wonder how Bobby fared in previous All Valleys as Johnny is a 2-time champ. As I was preparing my last video, that was something I really noticed was I've really felt for Bobby, because it seemed like Kreese was perfectly willing to sacrifice Bobby so that Johnny could be champion. And so you have to wonder, what kind of favoritism did Johnny enjoy from Kreese? Did Kreese boost Johnny's confidence, but not really give that same support to Bobby, or maybe kind of keep Bobby down a little bit, so mentally he didn't really believe he could beat Johnny? It's interesting, like Kreese is definitely a big manipulator. If Johnny was his favorite, could that have hurt Bobby's chances of winning the tournament and being the champion for the Cobra Kai dojo? Okay, next comment. Ken Cole, I love your channel. Thank you. You have the most underrated Karate Kid channel on YouTube. Thank you. Bobby's character is one of the most tragic ones in the Karate Kid trilogy. He seems like a decent, hardworking guy who fell in with the wrong crew, and Kreese anointed Johnny as the leader of the Cobra Kais. If Bobby would have had a teacher like Miyagi, he could have been a champion in his own right and would have utilized his good nature that he found later in life. Which is a really interesting point. Imagine if Bobby was paired up with Miyagi. What if Bobby, after the All Valley tournament, actually befriended Daniel and Mr. Miyagi and trained with him? How would Bobby have done with a mentor that would fully support him, that would have gone along with his compassionate nature? Because Bobby didn't seem to really fit Kreese's attitude of no mercy. I think that would have been a great sequel that we never got would be what happens with Bobby? What if Bobby trains with Miyagi? Would Bobby be friends with Daniel? And then our last comment, Bobby wins in real life. End of discussion. Which is totally true because Ron Thomas, the actor who plays Bobby, is in real life a 6th degree black belt in jiu-jitsu. So yes, I think he would totally win in real life. So anyway, thank you for your comments. It's been a really fun discussion. If you have any ideas, please leave them below. I definitely understand why Chozen is so popular, and I love Chozen as well, though I might still have to barely stick with Mike Barnes as being better than Chozen, at least in 1984, 1985. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.